Chapter 22, Imperialism and Colonialism, 1870 to 1914, which will take us right up to World War I. We're going to start right off with Egypt and the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal is a little very, well, let's take a quick look. Now, this is a map. As you can see, here's Egypt, and this area right in here is the Suez Canal. It brings you from the Mediterranean into the Red Sea all the way down. And as you can see, if you didn't have that, you'd have to go from London all the way down and around to get to India. So it's saving you, 7,000 plus miles. I would go back, okay. The economic and political relationships between the European powers in Europe were going to come under the heading of the Suez Canal because everybody wanted to use it and everybody wanted to control it. The Erba Pasha's government attempted to make Egyptian freedom and get them away from the English control, because the English at this time in the 1800s or the 19th century, they are the rulers of the seas. But Britain manages to get control of Egypt through the use of her Royal Navy, because armies is not something she was noted for, but Navy, yes, she is the most powerful Navy in the world. So the Suez Canal is just an example of the interplay between economics and colonialism. And we've got what we call the new imperialism. It's beginning to emerge in the late 19th century. Here again is a map. Now the definitions are that when you actually are taking over or setting up a colony, colonialism basically is the process of extending one state control over another. But there are various ways to do it. You can have formal imperialism, which is direct rule, where you annex a territory, you subjugate its inhabitants. Indirect rule is you govern through the local leaders, through either pressure or economics or politics. Now, informal imperialism is you allow a weaker state to maintain its independence the whole time you're reducing its sovereignty. And all of these different colonies and colonial settlements are going to be carved out of zones of European sovereignty and privilege. So everywhere you go, whether it's India, Africa, China, you're going to have a zone or a place that is strictly Egyptian or French or English or German or even Russian. You think you're in a different country. So the 19th century expansion of imperialism is going to be coming out of the even older colonial empires, where the mother country would set up a colony for the benefit of mercantilism. But colonial resistance and rebellions, first seen, of course, in the American Revolution, began to force the Europeans to, look at things a little differently and come up with new ideas and new strategies. Between 1875 and 1902, Europeans seized 90% of the continent of Africa. In 1870 to 1900, small groups of European states colonized 1/4 of the world's lands. So the new imperialism is not so much for mercantilism, it's a stage of empire building and increasing your prestige. At this point in time in 1900, as you can see, much of the world, especially poor Africa and India, they are controlled by other countries. They begin to appear against the backdrop because of industrialization and the liberal revolutions and the rise of nation states, because if you've got industrialization going on, you have a big need for raw materials and labor. So this need for raw materials is going to propel the new industrialization. And bringing progress to the world, and how this is used as a justification, we're going to make their lives better for them. So guided more by settlement and discipline than independent entrepreneurial activity, they begin to create new interactions between Europeans and the indigenous peoples. And of course, indigenous would be the native folks. And the sad thing is, a lot of times the native folks did not welcome and did not want the other countries coming in. But the economic arguments were by a man named J.A. Hobson. He said imperialism is driven by a small group of financiers, and genuine democracy would curb imperialism. We all have that sense, right? Lenin said imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. Yes, very true. The overthrow of capitalism, not democratic reform, would check imperialism. But historians nowadays, we all kind of agree that the economic pressures was only one of many causes, because those colonies were expected to produce profits much as the old colonies that were set up originally back when they first started having colonies. But international rivalries fueled the belief that national interests were at stake. Here we get nationalism is going to come into it. The French supported imperialism as a means of restoring their national honor, because after the revolution, in 1798 or 88, and the several more that they've had, and the empires that have been set up, and the different leaders, that they've kind of sunk down where they were number one as far as diplomacy was concerned before. They're way down on the list of prestige right now. So we want to restore our pride and our prestige. And of course, the British are worried about that newly unified Germany over there, because she is really going gangbusters and starting to industrialize. And if we're not careful, we're going to lose our world markets. But the Germans are smart people, and they realize that being unified was a big step forward, and imperialism, or having colonies to get raw materials from, is going to be the only way we can become a great power and become a big dog on the porch too. And the groups in all the nations, all the lobby groups, were arguing that imperialism meant nation building. So you have nationalism as a reason for imperialism, and then of course economics, because England didn't want to lose their markets to German industrialization, and Germany believed that the expansion of colonization was just the national continuation of a desire for unity. And of course there is that last place desire, the one they tried to put first, was you're going to help the underdeveloped nations. You're going to rise them up to your level. Yeah, Then you've got the cultural dimension. Cecil Rhodes, which is a man we'll learn a little bit more about very shortly, especially in Africa. He's described as a force-cast idea. He came up with ideas and was forceful enough to put them into effect. David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary, believed imperialism would put an end to the East African slave trade, or at least he hoped it would. But the reduction of famine, slavery, and illiteracy through imperialism was seen as a duty of the superior European civilizations. So motives for imperialism it kind of reminds me of a bowl of spaghetti. They kind of all overlap. And as your text says, it's too much to disentangle. So it's less a matter of long-range planning, more a matter of improvised responses to things that happened at the time. So let's talk just a little bit about India, that big, beautiful country. It was known as the jewel of the British crown. Now, until the mid-19th century, a company called the British East India Company controlled it. They had their own military, and they had divided the military into Europeans, are predominantly white, and the Indian divisions. They also had extensive control of taxation and trade, which is going to include the opium trade here shortly. And Haven was never what India was supposed to be. It was hot. The customs were so different than anything the Europeans knew. Their food was different, spices different. So as said, you had 45,000 British people there compared to 150 million Indians. But a lot of times your officers and your governors of provinces would take their wives and family, but for the most part, no. But when you get right down to it, the British East India Company had a military government style, and it was very repressive. Now, some of the areas of India were governed directly by the British Crown or the British East India Company. Others were using their local leaders. And they offered privileges to those who would ally themselves with the British against the others, the Rajapurs, the Bumars, the merchants of larger cities. And of course, offers of economic privileges and state offices or military posts to groups or even an entire state that agreed to rally against those who were against England and rally for England. But the British policy was never set in stone. It was a little bit divided. Part of people in Britain wanted to westernize India, make it like we are here. Another thought it was safer and more practical to defer to local culture, just give them guiding advice, but basically leave them alone to their own thing. Of course, the Christian missionaries wanted to replace superstition in Islam and Muslims and the Buddhism with Christianity. They had some good ideas. They wanted to eliminate child marriages. That's good. They wanted to eliminate sati, which was the habit or custom of when the man died, his widow was thrown onto the burning fire too. A lot of the Hindu custom and culture was seen as a form of despotism by the British Christians. And as long as they stuck to getting child welfare better and get rid of the child marriages and end this business of throwing the widow onto the burning fire, it was received rather well by the Indian people. But when you start messing with their religion, you're going to have a problem. And you couldn't even get a consensus of policy back in England. This is basically how India was divided before 1857. As you can see, the green areas are controlled by Great Britain, but it's going to change here very shortly. Well, I'm going the wrong direction, aren't I? Here we go. But after 1857, you get more and more green. You pretty much have almost, I'd say, 50 to 60% of India is under the control of the British Crown. Then you have something called the Great Mutiny of 1857. They were having enough problems, and they can't seem to get it through their legislative heads that you start messing with somebody's religion, you're going to have a problem. Near Delhi, the Sepoys, which was what the Indian soldiers were called, but they were Muslim and Hindus. And when the order came through to start using bullets that had been greased with pork fat, of course they objected because that's against their religion. Well, right off the bat, they had other complaints too. I mean, the economics, the taxes, and not having a say in the politics. And the Indian peasants began to attack the courts and burn tax rolls because if you haven't got any record of what I owe, it can't make me pay. They protested debt and corruption. And the British take a good hard look, and they'd always thought they were in control of everything, and now all of a sudden it looks like we don't have control down there. They were losing control of the northwestern part of India. The Hindus and the Muslims, they were denouncing the Christian missionaries. So the British, of course, had a response. A systematic and not very gentle campaign of repression. The rebel-supported towns and villages were destroyed, and the people were executed that were considered leaders. But defeat of the rebellion fired the imagination of the British public because it showed that the British had control. Now, this is a very brief little, I think, 4.5 minute about the Great Mutiny. And you will have a question on the test about the Great Mutiny. Here we go. Maybe. Come on, guys. Sometimes I think that YouTube doesn't like me too well. Here we go.
How I described earlier in this story, how the spread of the British Empire depended on the sea and control of the sea. Well, I'm in Portsmouth, home of the British Navy, and our story's moved on now to the 19th century, and this truly was the age of British sea power. The 19th century began with Nelson's defeat of the French fleet at Trafalgar. That was in 1805. Well, if you move on 50 years into the reign of Queen Victoria, we were no longer building wooden men of war. Now we were building massive, steam-powered ironclads like this, HMS Warrior, a ship so strong, so powerful, no enemy ship ever dared attack her. Truly, in the words of the old song, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves." Now, why am I getting so overexcited about this hulk of metal? Well, I'm trying to express the confidence that we Brits felt at this extraordinary moment in our history. Here we were, the world's first industrial nation, leading the world in innovation and technology, in control of territories across the globe from whom we bought raw materials to whom we sold manufactured goods. And our status as a global superpower seemed so utterly secure because we had gunships with the latest breech-loading cannon and 5 inches of armoured plate, and no one else did. But you know what they say, pride comes before a fall. And I want to describe an incident from the reign of Queen Victoria when our imperial confidence, at least for a moment, was punctured. It's the story of the Indian Mutiny. To tell this story, I'm yet again on a ferry, this time crossing the Solent, south of Portsmouth. Here, on the Isle of Wight, stands Queen Victoria's favourite residence, Osborne House. And in the east wing of Osborne House is the Durbar Room, a banqueting chamber designed to honour her role as Empress of India. Now, when Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, India wasn't yet under direct British control. At that stage, as I've explained, India was run by a private British company, the East India Company. And that situation continued until the year 1857, when India erupted in rebellion. It began with a mutiny. Local troops in the pay of the East India Company were angry at the introduction of ammunition greased with pig and cow fat, an insult to their religion. But soon this mutiny spread into something far worse. A full-scale uprising across the subcontinent, a violent rejection of British control, a rejection of the imposition of Britishness on the Indian way of life. The rebellion was eventually suppressed by British troops after unspeakable atrocities had been committed by both sides, and so began the so-called Raj, direct British control of India, which was to last for almost a century. But despite the speed with which, as we saw it, we put the damage right, this mutiny hit us hard. We were so used to imagining ourselves in control. More than that, we were used to imagining our civilization as being so obviously superior. Surely any native people offered the fruits of British rule would be grateful. Well, in this instance, clearly not. And so we'd looked to the roots of the mutiny for lessons. And we'd remembered how from the 1830s onwards we'd begun interfering with native customs, legislating against traditions that we deemed uncivilized. We'd outlawed sati, the practice of throwing widows onto the funeral pyres of their dead husbands. We'd outlawed thugi, a vicious sect of highwaymen who waylaid travellers on the roads. So far, so good. But then, we'd gone too far. We looked at India's great religions, Hinduism, Islam. We didn't understand them, we didn't like them. And so we'd sent out Christian missionaries to convert Hindus and Muslims to what we believed was the one true faith. And in so doing, we'd stirred up the discontent that turned a mutiny into a full-scale uprising. India, under the Raj, was the jewel in the imperial crown. But the crisis from which the Raj was born, the mutiny of 1857, revealed the fragility of our empire. More than that, it showed us what might happen if we thrust our ideas of civilization on a world that didn't want it. How well we had learnt that lesson remained to be seen.
So it's called the Great Mutiny or the Indian Mutiny. I don't remember how I referred to it in the test. But as you can see, those who were considered the leaders would be executed, which this is the way in any rebellion. So she starts about reorganizing. She abolishes totally the East India Company and begins governing directly with Rajas. Some were left to the local princesses, but of course they were always subjected to, the advice and guidance of the British advisors. The military was reorganized and the native troops were separated totally from the non-native troops to prevent subversive fraternization, they said. Of course, Queen Victoria, and that was a picture of her you saw, as Empress of India, supported indirect rule. She preferred that we just advise and lead leaders there. But they began to open the civil service to members of the Indian upper class. And that's something that we don't go into too much in this chapter, but you just briefly mentioned the caste system in India is very rigid. Yet missionary activity was no longer encouraged. Let's leave the local religions alone. And she begins to put resources into upbringing the economic system and the social infrastructure, with roads and railroads and irrigation and better ways of farming, doing things to actually help the people. So Lord Curzon, who was Viceroy of India from 1898 to 1905, could not stress the importance of India to Great Britain enough. Every chance he got, he was espousing it. He said India was Britain's largest export market. India provided the British Empire with laborers and professionals, and he also wanted to use India to strengthen the borders against Russia. So he pleaded with the British Parliament to realize just how important India was to Great Britain. 1.2 million Indian troops fought for British in World War I, and over 1 million Indians left to work elsewhere in the empire, often as servants. But the British indirect rule sought to create an Indian elite to serve the British interest. Oh, yes, of course. And large groups of British educated Indian civil servants and businessmen were working throughout the empire and all over Europe. And one of those educated, as it points out in your text, the educated Indian civil servant was a man called Mahatma Gandhi, who's going to be responsible for severing all ties with Britain here very shortly. Well, not shortly, but a couple of decades. But the Europeans never quite conquered China outright. They had several wars, but they were usually along the coast, never only inland. They did force trade agreements with the threat of war or violence. They set up treaty ports where the Europeans lived in their own jurisdiction. They had their own schools and churches and shops, their own little conclave. And they established outposts of missionary activity. So they aimed to improve the terms of the China trade to benefit Great Britain. Something called the triangular trade, which when you take American history, you learn a lot about trade from Europe to the New World and back again. But opium was grown in India, and it was shipped to the southeast and China. Profits were extremely heavy for the luxury goods for European markets. And, well, opium was consumed not only for medical purposes, but for pleasure. And it's a derivative. You use it for heroin. I mean, it's heroin's mixed in there with it. Not mixed in there with it, but anyway. It was very popular among the elite for, what do they call it? Social drug use. The soldiers to give them more stamina to go on, and students to give them the energy to do more studying, and of course the Chinese laborers to give them the will to face another day of hard labor. So opium was very well known, and of course our great British fictional detective Sherlock Holmes was a user of opium. The Chinese emperor thought this was a bad idea. He didn't like the drug, and he banned it. He began to start this campaign to get rid of the drug throughout the whole country of China. They even confiscated some British ships and took off the drug. And some ships were blockaded in ports. Well, anytime you interfere with trade or mess with the British merchants in any way, you're going to have a problem. So this basically, the Chinese emperor trying to rid his country of a bad drug is going to set the conflict up for what we call the Opium Wars. Now, there were two of them. The first one takes place between 1839 and 1842. But as your text says, it wasn't the main focus, because Britain had other plans too. They wanted sovereignty and economic status in certain areas of China. They wanted rights to trade anywhere they wanted to with anything they wanted to trade. And of course, the British Navy and the advanced military technology completely overcame the Chinese Navy. The Chinese had ships they called junks, which were kind of like paper tissue. So the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, ending the First Opium War, gave the British youngest trading privileges and opened up 5 different ports. It also gave them the little island city of Hong Kong forever. And then there was a second Opium War, and this time the Chinese lost again, and Britain gained further rights, including the rights to send in missionaries. As you can see here, this map, you've got the drug is grown here in India, and up here in the northeast, and shipped to Indonesia all the way up to China. China was their biggest source. Now you can see it didn't go to Japan. It didn't hit the Philippines. Their main source was China. Not their main source, their main object of selling it. He's working on it.
This is a map of East Asia in the 19th century. You can already see significant imperial control by Western European powers. You have the British East India Company in India. You have the French initially getting a foothold in southeast Vietnam in this orange area, but eventually they will take over this entire region that will become one day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. You have the Dutch in Indonesia, and you have the Spanish in the Philippines. But what we're going to focus on in this video is the European, and in particular the British attempt to open up the Chinese markets to British trade. China at the time under the control of the Qing dynasty. Well before this period, Chinese products were in demand in Europe, in particular Chinese porcelain and Chinese silk. Unfortunate for the Europeans, the Chinese did not have a lot of demand for European products. And so you had a balance of trade problem. These products would be exported from China into Europe, and you would have hard silver currency going to China. And so the imperial powers, especially the British, were looking for a solution. And they eventually found that opium grown in India, which is a highly addictive drug, it's the core constituent of heroin and morphine, could be addictive to the Chinese people and maybe could help solve this balance of trade problem, that silver could then flow outside of China. Well, you can imagine the Chinese government, the Qing dynasty, had no interest in opium coming into China. It was destructive to their society. It was an addictive drug. But in 1839, the British decide to force the issue, and you have what will be known as the First Opium War. This is a picture of the Second Battle of Chuen-Pi. You see the British vessel Nemesis, which is actually owned by a company, the British East India Company, destroying Chinese junk ships. And because of this show of force and this military superiority, they were able to win the First Opium War and extract major concessions from Qing China. The Chinese had to open up 5 ports to trade with the British. They had to give the island of Hong Kong to the British indefinitely, and the British would keep control of it all the way until the end of the 20th century. The Chinese had to pay for opium that they destroyed. They had to give reparations to the British to pay for the costs of the war. Now, to add insult to injury, the British were not satisfied. And in 1856, you have the Second Opium War, where they tried to extract even more concessions from China, after which opium is legalized, the whole time opium flooding into the country and really undermining the social fabric of society. To make matters worse for China, you have a major civil war in this time period, the Taiping Rebellion, which was started by this sect of Christianity that viewed it as their destiny to overthrow the Qing dynasty. And this is one of the most bloody civil wars that any nation has seen in history, with over 20 million people being killed. And historians believe that the Qing concessions to the British and then the French, and also the opium that was undermining Chinese society, was a major contributor to this long and bloody civil war. These opium wars are often cited by Japanese in this time period as a reason for their need to industrialize and become imperial powers so that they don't get unraveled the same way that Qing China does by the Europeans. But to appreciate that this was even controversial in Europe. William Gladstone, as we enter into the First Opium War, was a young parliamentarian in Britain, and he will eventually be, at the end of the 19th century, a significant British Prime Minister. But as the Opium War was beginning, he gave a famous speech in Parliament. It is a matter of certainty that if we stopped the exportation of opium from Bengal and broke up the depot at Linton, and checked the cultivation of it in Malwa, and put a moral stigma upon it, that we should greatly cripple, if not extinguish, the trade in it. The great principles of justice are involved in this matter. You, and he's talking to, I believe, the foreign minister, who is an aggressive proponent of the opium wars, you will be called upon to show cause for your present intention of making war upon the Chinese. They gave us notice to abandon the contraband trade, the trade in opium. When they found that we would not, they had the right to drive us from their coasts on account of our obstinacy in persisting in this infamous and atrocious traffic. And opium was addictive, and William Gladstone had personal experience with this. His sister became addicted to opium. He went on to say, I am not competent to judge how long this war may last. But this I can say, that a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace, I do not know and I have not read of. And a few days later he wrote, I am in dread of the judgments of God upon England for our national iniquity towards China.
So there were even British politicians who were against the sale. It was strictly a money thing from the word go. That's what they say, money is the root of all evil, and boy, that's proved true several times. But it wasn't only the British causing the emperor problems. Like I said, these two little videos I've shown you basically have been a repetition of what I've told you, and this is just a repetition of what he's telling you about the Taipei Rebellion. Repetition is the hallmark of learning. But other countries were demanding rights and economic opportunities in China, such as French, the Germans, the Russians. They wanted mining rights particularly. And British began manufacturing with Chinese labor. They even began to import some Chinese laborers to the United States on the West Coast to do their railroad building. The United States wanted a piece of the action. They realized that if you're going to become a big power on the big dog on the porch, you're going to have some colonies. And of course, the ones that were already there said, no, you can't come in. So the president came up with the idea, why don't we have what we call an open door policy and everybody trade equally? Well, that's not going to work. Then there was a war between China and Japan, and little Japan won the war. It was kind of a sign that Japan is ready to begin big talks with the big dogs. But after winning the Sino-Japanese War, even Japan forced China to concede her trading privileges. And also, she had to give up territory. This is when Japan gained control of Korea and part of Manchuria. And they had to pay reparations. It seems like every time you lose a war, you got to pay war reparations. So just losing the war isn't enough. You got to dig deep in your pockets. But the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, well, the Boxers is the Americanized version of the name. It's a secret society of men trained in martial arts, and they were anti-foreigners, they were anti-missionaries, and they began attacking the foreign engineers and the railways, and they marched on Beijing. Well, this is a very brief response. The great powers drew together to defend their Chinese holdings. Well, yes and no, but I don't know if you remember that map we were just looking at. Huh? You've got French and German and Chinese, and you got, not Chinese, but Russians and Belgians, and all these other people have their little areas of control over there. And to get help from anybody, they're going to have to come all the way around South Africa or drive all the way across on a train through Russia. It's going to take weeks, if not months, to get help. But, which we're fixing to get into, there's a little war that had just taken place between the United States and Spain, called the Spanish-American War. And when the war was over, the United States had left troops in the Philippines. So we had troops in the Philippines that could help. And, of course, they knew about this also in Europe, in China. And when they requested help from the United States, it kind of became a form of political blackmail. Sure, we'll send troops over to help you put down the Boxers, but you're going to have the open door policy and let us do some trading rights. That was sneaky, wasn't it? So, yes, the other countries managed to get some of their troops in there, but it was the American troops in the Philippines that arrived first, and the Boxers were put down. But it was just one of several anti-imperialist movements at the end of the 19th century. But it highlighted the vulnerability of the European imperial powers because their colonies are getting so spread out and so far away from the home that when something happens, it's hard to get help. Asia is particularly partitioned. Japan and Thailand remained independent, yes, but the Britons controlled India and Burma, Malaya, Australia, and New Zealand. The Dutch controlled Indonesia. The French controlled Indochina. And competition between the great powers, as they say, are growing considerably, and it's going to be unstable. And it's going to encourage a feeling of nationalism among the local populations. Imperialism in South and East in 1914, right before the war. As you can see, the Ottoman Empire is controlled by the French. The green is, the light green is in India. In Burma, of course, it's English. The yellow, the Dutch East Indies, are controlled by the Dutch. Naturally, Dutch East Indies. French, Portuguese, Japanese, and even the United States. We've all got a piece of the pie somewhere. But what about Russia? Did Russia get involved? Sure she did. She wants to be a big dog, too. But she had a policy of annexation. She didn't really want to set up colonies. So she would conquest, have a treaty, or both, and take over the adjoining areas. She, usually just countries right adjoining her, like Georgia, Galicia, Turkey, and Armenia. She did go southward, and she brought the Muslim populations into the Russian Empire. She brought Russia and Britain close to war over Afghanistan. Then we had the great game of spying. Russia's got spies, Britain's got spies, India's got spies. It continues even until today. There was the eastward expansion where she took over Mongolia and Manchuria, which is in China. Then Russia goes to war with Japan in 1904. Gets her butt kicked, big time. This little bitty country of Japan has defeated the Chinese, and now she's defeated the Russians. I mean, she is a fierce fighter. Of course, the Russians were totally humiliated. And I will say that our president, Teddy Roosevelt, was the one that brokered the peace treaty. So as you can see, the Russian Empire is getting larger and larger because she's not setting out colonies. She's just annexing, I guess you would say, the countries that she takes over right next to her borders. So the French are in Algeria, which is in Africa, North Africa. And it became, we call a settler state, because after one of the revolutions in France, a lot of French people decided to go there. It was set up as a utopian socialist community. And workers who had been exiled or voluntarily left after 1848 revolution went there. And one of the things they did was grow wine, because the French love wine. But not all of settlers were French. So under the Third Republic, started in 1870 by the French, Algeria was made a department of France, which gave all the French people living there the rights of republican citizenship of France. They consolidated their privileges, and they disenfranchised the indigenous Muslim populations who had been living there for generations and centuries. But all of a sudden, in their own homeland, they have no rights. The settlers were urged to lift up the native peoples, but very few were interested in doing something like that. Those altruistic projects were just not for them. They were there to make money. But they were differentiated between the good Berbers and the bad Arabs. After 1870, the civilizing mission went beyond Algeria. They tried to reinforce the French Republic and French prestige by expanding more into Africa. Jules Ferry argued for expansion into Indochina, into Indonesia, and to northern and central Vietnam. Well, it was known as Indochina at that time. It becomes Vietnam later on, and Laos and Cambodia, the whole area. But the French acquisitions was Guyana, Senegal, and the Ivory Coast on Africa. So you've got a little chunk at the top of North Africa, then you come over to the coast, and they've got some good areas. Federation of French West Africa. They were going to enhance the value of the region. But they did set up some public programs, and they always served the French interest, not the native peoples. Rationalizing the economic exploitation of the area because you're enhancing the value. You've got public programs. You're going to improve sanitation and health. You're going to upgrade the water system, build roads and railways for the French citizens, not the common people. Of course, there were obstacles to this civilizing mission. They had lack of resources and other money to carry out the ambitious plans. So they had great plans, but it costs money to build a road. You got to pay somebody. And there was massive resistance from the African peasants. They did not want to be French. They did not want the French things. They wanted to do things their way. And here again, the French have not learned a lesson that apparently the British have not learned totally. The scramble for Africa and the Congo. Europeans controlled about 11% of Africa in 1875, but by the end of the century, 90%. They learned how to master logistical problems and keep diseases at bay. And of course, we've got new weapons, which aids the conquest. So they increased their holdings in Africa all throughout the 19th century, and Italy even seized Ethiopia. Well, she lost it and she had to give it back because the native king and his army kicked Italian butt. Portugal expanded into Angola and Mozambique, and Germany, Cameroon, and Tanzania. We're pushing deeper and deeper into Africa because of some things that are going on in the Congo, the center of Africa. In the center of Africa and around the Congo River, you got fertile valleys. It's a lovely area. And the European colonizers under the Belgian king, Leopold II, calls all of his European representatives together and decides to carve up Africa. Herbert M. Stanley was a scientific explorer, exploring and mapping and bringing out information of the dark Africa, the center of it. There was an international association for the exploration and civilization of the Congo. And of course, the representatives, not even elected representatives, but elected representatives picked out by the legislators of the country, signed treaties with the local chiefs and elites. And they opened up the Congo to commercial exploitation, such as palm trees, oil, rubber, diamonds. Diamonds. We're getting down to the diamond area. But in response to the reactions of the other colonizers, Portugal in particular, there was a meeting called, and Otto von Bismarck, remember him, from unifying Germany. They established the ground rules for a new phase of European expansion into Africa. And France and Germany and Great Britain joined forces. So the Congo would be open to free trade and commerce. It's going to be called the Congo Free State, but it's going to be run by King Leopold's private company. Slavery was suppressed and outlawed in favor of free labor, but the free labor had worse conditions than the slaves did. And it became a Belgian colony in 1908 in response to the abuses. I believe this is our last little film.
This was called the Scramble for Africa. By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west
and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed. Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke for them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were." The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide. What the African inhabitants might think of this colonial carve-up was never asked. The European idea, in the words of one British governor, was to seize African territory and then, as much as possible, rule the country as if there were no inhabitants. In fact, European contempt for Africans now reached new depths, and no wonder. For how otherwise than by asserting that Africans were helpless children, lazy savages, could Christian Europe justify taking their countries away from them? The helpless children, meanwhile, sang their own version of a famous hymn. Onward, Christian soldiers, into heathen lands, prayer books in your pockets, rifles in your hands. Take the happy tidings where trade can be done. Spread the peaceful gospel with the Gatling gun.
Rhodesia in southern and eastern Africa. Cecil Rhodes is a name that you may have been familiar with because he's associated with diamonds. He was like the eighth son of a rather poor farmer, but he managed to go to Africa and make his fortune. And he's the founder of the diamond mine, the De Beers. He was prime minister of the Cape Colony. His personal goal was to build an African empire founded on diamonds and to carve out territories in what is now Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Botswana. He also wanted to build a railway all the way from the Mediterranean all the way to his colony in South Africa, making Britain self-sufficient and conducting raw materials with Europe empire from the empire in the south back to the industry producing goods for all citizens of the empire. He was a small man, but he was determined and very forceful and managed to get a lot of things done, and he's either condemned or blamed for all the things that happened in South Africa, including apartheid. It's your change. Advertising or propaganda supported imperialism is good for any nation. And museums in different countries are displaying the products of an empire, like the museums in England have so many things from Egypt. Music halls and imperialistic songs, and of course the literature, everything about dark Africa and how you can make your fortune there and how bad it was and how good it was. But empire and identity are connected to high moral purposes of imperialism, such as the civilizing mission of the French. British were the missionary race, and of course even female reformers. They're critical of the governments at home, but they really supported empire, demanding rights for women to participate in the empire building. Now, scientific racism helped reconcile high ideas with imperialistic contempt for other people. These are some things written by some people. Arthur D. de Goen about the inequality of the races. He said race was the master key to understanding the world's problems, that the humans were divided into black, yellow, and white races, and white blood was more pure, thus whites were superior. Houston Stewart Chamberlain said that making racial theory more scientific, we need to tie the racial theories of Darwinism and Herbert Spencer, because race will change or evolve over time, but right now these inferior peoples are at the stage of childhood. Francis Galton wrote, eugenics improved the population by selective breeding. This is one of the first times we even hear the word eugenics. Hobson and Lennon, he said imperialism was an act of greed and arrogance. Joseph Conrad wrote, imperialism reflected deep pathologies in European culture. Men and women in the colonies, i.e. the British Committee of the Indian National Congress, of course, were for it. Then there was something formed called the Pan-African Congress in 1900 that argued that the forced labor in the diamond mines was equivalent to slavery and brought abolition rhetoric to bear on imperialism. Of course, our own American African emancipationist W.E.B. Du Bois issued a call to action for all the black people. It was the most defiant of opposition gatherings trying to get rid of the slavery, because maybe you've heard something about blood diamonds. They're diamonds that come out of unsanctioned mines where the people that are forced to mine them are treated worse than dogs. Bombay, Calcutta, Shanghai more than tripled in size. And colonialism created new hybrid cultures, because you start mixing your new with your old, and your annexed areas became laboratories for creating order and disciplined societies. Worry over preserving national traditions and identity, of course, came to the forefront, and the thought of sexual relations provoked contradictory responses, because each country had their own idea of how the different sexes should interact. So what about the Muslims? Because we're going into a mostly Muslim area. Prior to the 19th century, most trade went towards Europe, and due to imperialism and industrialization in the late 19th century, the Muslim societies began to import manufactured goods from Europe, more than they'd ever done before. And of course, this benefited the Christian minorities in the Middle East. But the European influence also brought challenges for the Muslim societies to adapt to the modern world. And the religious scholars, they were torn. Should we modernize and try to join the rest of the world, or should we look back to our religious traditions and maintain them? Enter Muhammad Ali, not the Kentucky fighter. He was an Ottoman general from Albania, and he attempted to create a modern Muslim state in Egypt, after defeating the rulers and seizing power himself. He did create a centralized government. He modernized agriculture for his country. He reformed the educational system. He designed an economic policy to generate profit for everyone. Unfortunately, future leaders were unable to keep modernization efforts going because of challenging to the rising national debt. But he was remembered as the founder of the modern Egyptian state, Muhammad Ali. But all this stuff that's going on, all this empire building and colonization and demand for trade, is going to create a lot of tension between the Western nations. It's going to cause expansion of economic and military commitments overseas and starting to sign treaties for protection of each other. Italy developed a small empire along the shores of the Red Sea in 1880s to 1890s. Then they invaded Ethiopia in 1896, but they didn't keep her because the Ethiopians under Menelik II destroyed the Italian armies, and it was a humiliation for Italy and a symbol for African rebels and radicals. And Italy will try it again here very shortly in the 20th century. Fashola. The British attempt to connect Cairo to the Cape of Good Hope, which was that railroad that Rhodes wanted, and local uprisings were used as an excuse for the British to move in and clear the area to supposedly do it. But British General Gordon and his troops were massacred by Madadi's forces, and it took about 10 years before the British could actually retaliate and gain back. General Kitchener at Khartoum defeated him, but the British victory over the Mahdi alarmed the French because now the French think the British are getting too close to their territory. So British and the French nearly went to war, and the British and French troops faced off for weeks, just kind of at a stalemate. Finally, France seceded southern Sudan in exchange for British halt to expansion. And this is all right before the First World War, the Boer War. Afrikaners, the Boers, or Dutch and Swiss settlers who had arrived in the early 19th century in South Africa. And they never did get along too well with the British in South Africa, and they set up two republics, Transvaal and Orange Free State. Cecil Rhodes provoked war between the Boers and the British in order to gain control of the diamond mines there. And the British Army, they thought it was going to be a short little quick war and be over with. How many times have they thought that and got surprised? But the Boers fought ferociously. And it was a guerrilla war that dragged on for 3 years, and it was brutalities committed on both sides. But they got caught up in the European war between Britain and the Afrikaners, the South Africans did. And the British started using concentration camps, as it points out, this is the first time you use this term, where the Afrikaner citizens would be held prisoner, the women and children and older men. The British Union of South Africa. The Afrikaners finally ceded the republics in exchange for a share of power. And it led eventually to a system of racial segregation known as apartheid in South Africa between the peoples of European descent and of African descent. Meanwhile, what I mentioned briefly a while ago about the Spanish-American War, America wasn't involved in imperialism before 1898. There were some who spoke up for it, but the others said, no, it's something Europe would do. It's not something we Americans want to get involved in. But there's this problem. We have expanded to the Canadian border. We've expanded to the Mexican border. We've expanded from sea to sea. And we're producing like crazy. The Industrial Revolution has hit big time in the United States. And we've got more products, and we got people to buy stuff, and we need raw materials. So war with Mexico in 1840, we got in the American Southwest. But now... And in reality, I guess you could say the war was started by two newspaper rivals in New York, each one going for circulation and printing stories that were not true. The Spanish had been in Cuba since day one, and they'd never been nice. The Cuban people had risen up several times, but were always put down. But now we're starting to read newspaper articles about the atrocities committed by the Spanish soldiers on the native peoples. And of course, they have a king or queen of Spain, and you've got a monarch. I mean, we got rid of our monarch. Maybe we ought to help them get rid of their monarch, seems to be the mantra. So the president, he had been in the Civil War. He knew what war was like. He didn't want to get the United States involved in a war. But the newspapers are hounding, the people are hounding. We need to do something to help the Cuban people. And we've got economic interest down there. We've got sugar plantations and all this kind of good stuff down there. We've got money down there. So they sent an American battleship down to Havana to check it out. Now it says here accidentally exploded. We didn't know at the time it was an accident. We didn't discover that for decades. We thought either the Cubans had destroyed the main ship, and not the main ship, the ship was called the Maine, or the Spanish government had done it. It never dawned on us to think that when we finally got where we could explore the ship a little bit, we discovered that the explosion came from inside the ship. There was coal fumes from an empty coal container that had exploded, and the explosion went from the inside the ship out. It was never torpedoed. But we've got our interest. Now we can go to have a jolly little war. Well, we declared war, and it was a good war. It was a quick war. It was over in a few weeks, and we finally met somebody called Teddy Roosevelt, who's going to become governor of New York and then president of the United States. But now we're going to be involved in colonialism and imperialism because, I mean, Spain, she lost the war, so she's going to have to give us her Spanish-held properties, which we got Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba. Well, we formed a protectorate over Cuba and helped them form a government and helped them write the Constitution. But the Philippines, we decided that the people weren't really ready to have everything turned over to them. Some of the unions here in the States didn't want the Philippine people to come in as cheap labor. And so we decided just to keep military there to bring them up, lift them up, improve the infrastructure. Well, as a matter of fact, a man named Taft was appointed governor, who becomes another president later on. We built hospitals, we improved the roads, but some of the Filipino people who had been fighting with us against the Spanish decided we don't want to exchange one world power for another. We get rid of the Spanish, we don't want the Americans to come in. So there was a rather bloody guerrilla war for a couple of years, and it should have been used as a playbook for the Vietnam War, but they didn't learn. The brutal war, and we stayed in there in the 1940s. Panama, well, our president, Roosevelt, backed a rebellion. Actually, he almost provoked it because he wanted to build a canal from the Gulf of Mexico over to the Pacific Ocean. And we established Panama as a republic and built the Panama Canal. We intervened in Hawaii and San Diego, and every time you turn around, it looks like we're getting more involved in other countries, but it's usually Central and South America at this point in history. But up until 1898, we kind of stayed within our boundaries, and then we kind of joined the imperialistic crowd. More than 50 million Europeans migrated overseas between 1820 and 1930, and 2/3 of them wound up in the United States. But some went to Canada, Brazil, and Australia. But the problem was, especially in some of these areas at this time frame, the Civil War hadn't been over that long. There's still an awful lot of racism going on. So some of these people coming in had to compete with former slaves for not very well-paying jobs. And they brought with them the food and the animals that they had, in their country, and it changed this. It kind of altered the biological structure of the new lands, and it accelerated what we call the Columbian Exchange back in the 16th and 17th. For instance, in 1900, 63% of the grasses in California were Eurasian, and the lovely bluegrass Kentucky is from Europe. European pigs spread all across Australia, and the European cattle populated into the millions in Argentina, and European sheep grew to millions in New Zealand. So they brought with them ecological changes. And meanwhile, the native peoples are shrinking in numbers. Native Americans, which had numbered 2 millions, down to thousands living on reservations in America. Maori New Zealand population fell from 200,000 to fewer than 50,000. And the cities, once they move into the cities and even build cities, they become more and more like the cities in Europe. And the balance of power economically is shifting from Europe, the old world, to the new world and the former colonies. Because of rapid expansion of formal European control, there's relations between the West and the world, and new forms of economic exploitation, new patterns of social discipline and settlement, all driven by needs of industrial, territorial conflict, and nationalism. Nationalism is going to be at the top. We're going to create a self-consciously imperial culture in the West. It's going to contribute to a sense of crisis when anything happens anywhere else in the world. Because now we have technology, we know what's going to happen, or we know what's happened in a country within minutes of it's happening. But the Western expansion was not unchallenged. There was resistance. So the people who had the home rule of the colonies had to continually change their strategies. And after the First World War, it was impossible to reimpose the conditions and control that there was going on before the war. And this concludes the lecture. I will remind you, if you haven't already, you do need to go over that word list because it's a longer one than usual. And there's people's names and happenings. This is very important that you need to know these for the upcoming test. That being said, don't forget your quiz.